So hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for Smart Prosperity Institute's webinar on nature-based solutions, policy options for climate and biodiversity. So my name is Catherine Monahan, and I'm a Senior Research Associate here at Smart Prosperity, and one of the principal researchers for the report, which is available on our website at institute.smartprosperity.ca. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Ben Vilewood, who will take us through the second half of the presentation. So let's jump in. So Canada's vast forests and lands play an important role in regulating the climate. And last August, IPCC put out a special report on climate change and land. And they're pretty clear that policies on the land and forest sectors are needed, and that we really can't have a climate plan that doesn't include nature. And this is particularly true for the goal to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So Canadian policymakers understand this, and programs are beginning to roll out. The most well-known program is probably the Liberal platform announcement, which looked to plant 2 billion trees as part of a 3 billion fund for natural climate solutions. But there's also provincial actions taking place, such as British Columbia's Forest Carbon Initiative. And there's also a bunch of going on with regard to carbon offsets, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. So as these initiatives are gaining momentum, we wanted to think about and explore if a specific focus on carbon could risk undervaluing the other benefits that nature provides. Because nature also provides a slew of other benefits, such as climate resilience through natural infrastructure, clean air and water, and the conservation and protection of biodiversity. So we were specifically looking at how can nature-based climate solutions policy be designed to realize climate objectives while also advancing biodiversity goals. And since we're mostly economists here, we also wanted to address the issue of policy efficiency. So Canada obviously doesn't have infinite financial resources, so how can we get the most value for money? So we discovered that there's at least 3 risks of ignoring biodiversity in climate policy development. So first of all, there could actually be adverse impacts on biodiversity if you're only thinking about climate benefits. So for example, if you're planting trees on natural grasslands, or you're harvesting old growth forests to plant faster growing trees, these would destroy important ecosystems and their services. There's also projects may be ruled out because of high carbon costs, even when they have high values in other areas. So for example, wetland restoration. So we found that wetland restoration can be quite costly from a climate change perspective on a sort of per ton basis. But if you're thinking about biodiversity benefits, then they can offer substantial value. And as well as cost savings if you're thinking about climate resilience. And then the third one on the list is pursuing multiple goals separately could be less efficient. So this is particularly true when policymakers are working in silos. There could be a problem of additionality. So in this case, what could happen would be that outcome might have happened anyways because of a policy or program that exists in parallel. Okay, so we're going to talk about public funding models in this slide. So here's just a quick introduction to sort of funds to watch in 2020. So I already mentioned the potential for a 3 billion fund for natural climate solutions. And then there's also the Canada Nature Fund that includes the goal to protect at least 70% of Canada's terrestrial areas and inland waters by 2020. But the government's recent commitment to conserve 25% of Canada's lands and 25% of its oceans by 2025, or even 30% by 2030, will require additional funding. So we're sort of watching Budget 2020 closely. And it's going to be important to see biodiversity objectives reflected in these funds. And it's also going to be important to make sure that we're measuring, reporting, and optimizing the GHG net removals that we can get from these funds. Okay, so this slide, we're jumping into funding principles. We're still talking about public funds here, although a lot of these principles apply to private funding models as well. But policymakers will want to develop strong principles to basically to ensure that the money that they spend leads to good and efficient projects and programs. So I won't go over every point here. There's a lot more detail in the report itself. But just as sort of an example, let's talk about additionality again. So applying only one aspect of the additionality principle to, it's actually a pretty complex concept, so just sort of one aspect here, but let's apply it to the 2 billion tree planting initiative. And it would mean that any planting would need to be incremental to existing actions and regulations. So there's actually already regulations that stipulate that trees cut for commercial harvest must be replanted. So that means what we'd be left with is planting in areas that are not naturally forested, forest restoration, maybe urban tree planting, and we could talk about planting in areas like fire scars or seismic lines. However, there's other aspects to additionality that need to be considered, including financial additionality. Maybe just jumping to sort of one of the principles for verifiable, we would want to make sure that projects can be managed over the long term and verified for their ongoing carbon benefits. And then since we're looking at integrating biodiversity, we would also want to make sure that the project is not going to do any harm to biodiversity. So building in strong safeguards is important. So like, you know, obviously something like insisting on planting with native species, but we actually want to go one step further and actually try to incent positive outcomes to biodiversity. So you could do this through science-based values. So for example, is the project or the conservation area located somewhere where it will be important for species at risk? Is it important for connectivity or conservation corridors? Or does it have high compositional diversity? And the last important principle I want to mention here is the cost integrity. So how can we ensure that we're getting the value that we're looking for at the lowest cost? And we would recommend generally following a market-based method if possible. And one of the methods that we outline in the report is the reverse auction structure. So reverse auctions work by having project proponents present their projects, their potential projects in terms of both the carbon and biodiversity benefits. And then they pretty much bid against each other, where the government would choose the lowest cost option. And the second half of this presentation, we'll talk a little bit more about developing criteria that could be applied to this type of funding model. Okay, so this slide is all about carbon offsets. So we think about carbon offsets as a funding model that can ensure, that can achieve multiple benefits beyond carbon when we think about these design principles. So we call this a private funding model. And it means that it's not governments, but rather environmentally conscious individuals or companies or regulated firms that are financially supporting the projects. So there's numerous carbon offset protocols in Canada's voluntary carbon market that support nature-based solutions. So if you'd like to offset you know, a trip that you're taking, you can purchase these offset credits. And the voluntary offset protocols can include additional accreditation for biodiversity improvements. So all you would need to do is to ensure that you're funding a project that supports carbon and biodiversity through purchasing credits such as gold standard or VCS credits that include an add-on that, well, in the former case is called Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Standard. Where projects would need to demonstrate net gains in each of these over time. But things get a lot more complicated when we're looking at the compliance market. And this is because regulated firms are looking for the cheapest way to comply to the regulation. So they don't really want to buy anything that they don't have to. And if offsets that are available are also supporting biodiversity or other goals, they could be more costly, and the firms just wouldn't buy them. So this sort of relates to the federal output-based pricing system, which is how large industrial emitters are facing carbon pricing in Canada, and where offsets will need to be the cheapest, offsets will need to be cheaper than the backstop carbon price. So we've outlined a few ways in the report to get around this conundrum. I'll just sort of very briefly cover them here, with a lot more detail available in the report itself. But first of all, you could mandate a certain % of a regulatory requirement to be fulfilled by these premium sort of multiple benefit credits. But of course, the drawback is that this would mean building this requirement into the regulation itself, and could be add some complexity to the system. The other way would be that governments could offer a price top-up. So the top-up price would provide a bit of extra financing above the price that the proponents receive on the market to help cover the extra costs associated with biodiversity benefits. So the drawback of this approach is that it would actually require a little bit of public funds, and it would therefore switch the model to a public-private partnership type of funding model. So a final option could be credit stacking. And so credit stacking was noted in the federal offset discussion paper as something that they could consider allowing for the new system. So credit stacking involves allowing a single project to produce credits for multiple environmental markets. So for example, a carbon offset and a biodiversity offset. And in principle, stacking could allow a single action to be properly rewarded for multiple values. But there are some drawbacks to be considered. And once again, the issue of additionality comes into play. So basically, are we paying for the same benefit twice? And the other consideration is that parallel markets, so parallel markets for conservation or biodiversity, would need to be developed. And we would really need to see these developed for this to work in practice. So, I mean, wetland and conservation offsets do exist in Canada, such as for fish habitat, but these markets are currently small, and they're lacking in the scale and the scope to support meaningful credit stacking. So we would need to develop stricter habitat replacement mandates. So maybe things to look out for is something under the new Impact Assessment Act for major projects. But the point is that simply enabling stacking is not enough. We need to make sure that the parallel markets and demand drivers are developed in parallel. Okay, so we've talked a lot about Canada's land's ability to sequester carbon, but the land sector can also be a large source of emissions. For example, when land and soil are disturbed or wetlands are drained, hydro dams can cause substantial methane release for many years. And many of these activities that disturb carbon can also disturb biodiversity. So first step in regulating or pricing the related emissions, and therefore sort of indirectly helping biodiversity, would be better tracking reporting, just sort of getting a better sense of the GHG numbers associated with land cover change in Canada. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Ben Filewad to take us through the rest of the presentation, and then we will hopefully have a couple of minutes for quick questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine, and hi everyone. And just to note that there is a Q&A dialogue on your screen there. You can type them in, and we'll have a few minutes at the end to try to tackle some of them. So we talked a bit about the opportunities, and I think we touched on the challenges that face nature-based solutions in Canada. And for the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the technical work that went into this report to meet some of these challenges. So how can we unlock some of these nature-based solutions? And in broad strokes, we have public funding models and private funding models. I'm going to focus on offset markets here just for well, time, in fact. There's different challenges that each of these approaches face. So for public funding, maximizing gains per dollar spent, demonstrating progress toward policy targets are core challenges to any effective policy. And you also have to decide which projects get funding. In offset markets, we rely on market-based mechanisms to achieve efficiency. And so we're hoping that we'll get the lowest cost offsets or the most output per input based on competitive markets. Instead, we had this challenge that Catherine touched on of ensuring the additionality of co-benefits. So if we're going to have, for instance, a top-up scheme in offsets, it had better be the case that the additional funding does in fact unlock something additional that wouldn't have happened with just the base carbon price. But both of these funding models face the challenge of deciding which projects get funded, what gets the top up or what gets the funding. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the remaining few slides here. So we're going to talk about, we can just advance the slide one point here. We're going to talk about classes of co-benefits and dimensions of those classes. So for instance, biodiversity is a class of co-benefits. So there's also social co-benefits. Within the class biodiversity, there's a bunch of different dimensions, species at risk conservation, for instance, or connectivity or resilience. So how can we compare between these things that are fundamentally different? And just so I think we all probably know the challenge here, but unlike with a mitigation only project where you have an established method for wrapping everything up into a single unit, megatons of carbon, say, or carbon dioxide equivalent, when you're looking at nature-based solutions that have so many different outcomes and so many different domains, there's not an obvious way to compare between them. So let's move on to the next slide and talk about some of the things that can be done. So if you have common dimensions, if you have, if you're looking, let's say, at biodiversity projects, and you have common dimensions of biodiversity that you can compare between projects, for instance, these are all forest conservation projects, and you have kilometers squared of forest conserved, comparison's fairly easy. In most cases that we've discussed in this presentation, that opportunity just isn't there. So what can you do? Well, you can attempt to put everything into a common unit, and the main approach here would be economic valuation, put everything into monetary terms. There's many cases where that's just not practical or feasible in the context of specific policy design. And there are also no common units. So what can you do there? Well, we've looked into the literature on it, and we're trying to pull together some of the solutions that are available. You can attempt to aggregate over different dimensions of a co-benefit and come up with an index number that gives you one single number that scores, say, the biodiversity of these different projects, and you can compare on that basis. Or you can keep all those different dimensions. And so for biodiversity, we're thinking about things like species at risk conservation, critical habitat, connectivity, landscape resilience, and of course, there's different levels of biodiversity, species or genetic diversity. So we can keep all those different dimensions, and we can try to evaluate projects in all those dimensions at the same time. And there's roughly two ways to do that. One is ordinal concepts, which means we're going to rank projects based on these different dimensions, not try to score them in absolute sense, but just rank them. And another will be efficiency concepts. So we'll go to the next slide, and I'll take us through a couple of these. So if you have the option to make comparisons in a common unit, I think probably everyone's familiar with economic valuation methods. Willingness to pay is a common one. That's the stated preference approach for a type of direct valuation. I'd just like to note, indirect valuation is an emerging field here, and there's some really exciting work presented at SPI last year by Eli Finichel of Yale, looking at shadow pricing for environmental assets. Really some big gains to be made there. The problem is that these methods are resource intensive. You need highly trained people to put a lot of time in to come out with a credible and defensible number. And so for some of the policy types we're talking about here, specifically something like offsets, where you're looking for decentralized, many small projects, that might not be an option. If you can find non-economic common units, fantastic. You can maybe create them if you can't find them. So one way to create them would be to normalize. So for instance, instead of looking at the absolute numbers of mammals and fish in different projects, you could compare the numbers that exist now to some baseline, for instance, against a natural reference state. It's also possible to aggregate over many dimensions. And so you evaluate on these different dimensions, number of animals or connectivity or resilience, and you assign some sort of weighting scheme to aggregate those dimensions up into an index number. Or you can assess them all in one go holistically. And we'll talk about that in 2 slides. So can we move on to the next slide, please? If you don't have common units, well, you can pursue purely ordinal concepts. And Catherine made reference to the social carbon standard before. I find this is a really intelligible way to sort of understand what this idea is. So social carbon is evaluating projects on 6 different dimensions. And those dimensions, the evaluation is separate. There's no attempt to make trade-offs between dimensions or to weight the value of progress in one dimension against progress in another. You're scored on all 6 simultaneously. In this case, though, it's a bit more difficult to say what progress has been made overall. So the voluntary standards that Catherine mentioned rely on simple heuristics. So there, in the case of social carbon, it's necessary to demonstrate continuous improvement across all 6 dimensions simultaneously. You can take this concept a step further when you approach efficiency measures. And an efficiency measure, cost-benefit analysis is the well-known example here. So if you have some measure of output and some measure of input, you divide output by input, and you get a sense of how efficient that this project is producing outputs given inputs. So in the case of top-up pricing, for instance, it would be, how many co-benefits do you get given the top-up price that you paid? And similarly for a government-led large nature-based solution project. Some approaches that have been used here. A cost utility analysis has been used for evaluating different parks in New Zealand. We have a spotlight on that in the report. The most flexible one, and maybe the most promising, is data envelopment analysis. And we won't get into it here. It's a little bit more complicated, but the ability here is you can look at multiple inputs and multiple outputs simultaneously, and things don't have to be in different units. So if you're looking at biodiversity and you're measuring biodiversity outcomes in numbers of species at risk protected or critical habitat area conserved or more meta attributes like landscape level connectivity, you can have all those different outputs per project, and you can score all projects against them and normalize by the input, which can be perhaps just the funding that went in, or maybe there's other inputs that you want to keep track of. And DEA, data envelopment analysis, gives you a way to evaluate the efficiency of different projects, even when they have very, very different circumstances. So let's move to the next slide. To make this all a little bit concrete, I just want to give you the example of Habitat Hectares, a successful program which applies some of these concepts from Australia. Habitat Hectares was a landscape offsetting program. It was trying to find a way to quality adjust hectares of land that were used to offset one another. So here what's of interest is the class of co-benefits biodiversity and a number of dimensions of that class. So species abundance and connectivity, et cetera. You could score each class separately and specify an aggregation rule. What Habitat Hectare does is it sends an expert assessor to make a holistic evaluation. So an expert assessor goes in, looks at the state of vegetation, compares it to an overall natural baseline, and comes out with a quality index. And there's structured guidance from the state government, I believe it is, that aids the assessor. There's a policy in place that gives them the framework, similar to the policy that's in place in the Alberta wetland offset scheme. And then once you have a quality rating per hectare, you adjust the number of hectares by this quality index. So if it's 1 high quality hectare might be worth 8 very low quality hectares. And this gives you a way to make comparisons. Next slide, please. So we've covered a lot in a hurry here. I just want to pull out a few big points, and I'm going to end on a quick example. So a few big points to pull out. Economic valuation, it does make comparisons easy if you can put everything in dollar terms, but it's often not feasible simply because of the resources that are required to be put in. So if you're looking at evaluating a government program that spends $100 million, absolutely, yes, this is something you can do. If you're looking at offset markets where individuals are coming forward, private citizens are coming forward with small projects, this is going to be a little bit unwieldy. Second, we talked about evaluating things in a single dimension and trying to wrap it all up in the one dimension versus evaluating in many. I mean, the Habitat Hectares approach is being criticized for not getting all the rich detail and complexity of biodiversity. So when you wrap everything up, you lose important detail. It's probably preferable to compare in multiple dimensions if you can. Third, the measurement choices that we make will embody some social preferences. There's no perfect way to make comparisons. We have to accept the imperfections of techniques. That's okay. The important thing here is objectivity. We don't want, in smart policy design, we don't want specific interest groups pushing the agenda one way or another. We're trying to come up with an objective level playing field where different projects can be weighed. And lastly, there's no avoiding hard work. So I was tempting to try to download these things to the private sector. There's capacity challenges there. Leaving things to market-based efficiency is also, tempting, but smart policy design has to be in place to ensure that the market incentives are channeled in such a way that optimal social outcomes are achieved. So there's definitely work to be done, but there are some exciting solutions and there's some promising solutions. I'm going to go to the last slide here, and we have 5 minutes. If anyone has questions they want to add, just type in there in the Q&A and I'll hurry it up. Otherwise, I'll take a couple minutes with this last slide. So just to give you a sense of how these things could fit together. One of the policy models we talked about was offset top-up. So what are the challenges if you want to have top-up funding for example, biodiversity co-benefits in a carbon offset scheme? Well, you need to ensure that the co-benefits are additional, and you have to choose which projects get the top-up. So one way you could put these things together is by evaluating projects on multiple different dimensions, employing a reverse auction to try to identify the lowest cost at which these benefits could be delivered, ranking the different projects based on their efficiency, and then funding the most efficient first. And this would be a way to try to get the lowest cost, most bang for your buck co-benefits built on top of an offset system. So just looking in more detail at the first item there, the evaluation matrix. Did we just advance the slide one? We'll get a quick image there. And this would just be showing that you could score projects on things like water quality index or protected area or connectivity. You can score all projects on a common set of dimensions, but they don't all have to do something in each dimension. So you could have water quality index might not be affected by a grasslands conservation project. That's fine. Then proponents submit bids for the top-up price. And here we're trying to get competition. We're trying to get the power of markets to get people to, through a reverse auction, submit the lowest cost at which they are able to deliver those benefits. Then we move to an efficiency ranking. And you could use, data and development analysis would be my preference. There was also cost benefit analysis, just normalizing outputs by inputs. And you're ranking these different bids to see, given the price that they want to deliver the benefit, how much benefit can they deliver? So quite a simple idea. And then lastly, you fund the most efficient first. I'm calling this a cascading top-up, for example. You fund the most efficient until it is able to go, you give it all the funding it needs, and then the second most efficient and the third. And of course, you can add sort of simple heuristics there to prevent one project from taking up the lion's share of the funding. So that's just a sense of how these things could fit together. We've got a few minutes left for questions. I'll turn it over to Catherine to moderate the Q&A, and I'd encourage you to punch some in if you have something you'd like to ask.
Okay, thanks, Ben. So again, we have about 3 minutes left for questions. Haven't seen too many come in. There's one question that's come in. It is a real question, I swear. It says, can we get copies of these slides and the report this discussion is based on? Thanks. So this presentation will be made available on our website, including the oral presentation as well as the slides. And of course, the report, which is a fairly hefty, longer report, is also available on our Smart Prosperity Institute website. So again, that's institute.smartprosperity.ca. And we'll just leave it for one more minute to see if there's any other questions, and then otherwise we'll let everybody get back to their lunch hour. Okay, so that I think at that then we're just about out of time. So that will conclude the presentation and the webinar. So thank you very much to everybody for attending. And please do read the report online if you can find the time. We're also available to answer sort of any follow-up questions that you may have. You can just reach out to us directly. And I'd also just like to note that Smart Prosperity Institute's past webinars are also available on the website. So you can go back to past subjects to hear the presentation as well as see the slideshow. So thanks again for participating and have a great rest of the day.